kind of in keeping with the theme of shutting down the projection screens and stepping back into time, we're going to kind of carry that in as we dive into the message. But as we do that, I want to invite you, because we don't have the screen, to pull out a Bible. There's Bibles under the seats in various places throughout the room, or you can grab your phone, turn on your Bible. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 3. We're going to be hanging out in Matthew chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 4 in a little while. But, you know, even as you open up the Bible, you turn the page and you kind of smell that book you're opening, because maybe you use the app, the Bible app, or BibleGateway.com or something like that for your, quiet time or personal devotional life when you read Scripture. It's amazing when we really think about how much our world has changed in the digital age. I mean, think about how much has changed in just 10 years. I mean, for most of us, probably in the last decade is when we got a smartphone for the very first time. Think about 25 years ago, 1995. Nobody even knew what a smartphone was. Like, the best you had as a car phone was something you carried in a bag, like a purse, right? You go back 50 years to 1970. Think about how dramatically the world has changed. Think about speed. The speed at which information is available for us on these mini computers we carry in our pockets. Well, as we kick off kind of week 3 of this series, Travel Light, let's take a journey back even further in time to some pivotal technological advancements in human history and look at the impact that they had. So go with me back to the year that Jim Brown was born, 1370 AD, okay? 1370 AD. 1370 was really a turning point in the way that the West looked at time. 1370 was the year the first public clock tower was erected in Cologne, Germany. Before 1370, time was just natural. It was only measured by the sun and the moon and the earth's rotation and the 4 seasons. That was it. That was the only way to measure it. People went to bed when it got dark and they woke up when the sun came up. I mean, really what gave permission and ability to actually work and provide what you needed to survive was the sun. And in the summer, the days were long and busy and full because there was so much to do, to produce, so that when the winter came and the days were shorter and slower, you would have enough to survive. There was a real rhythm or cadence to every day and even the whole year. There's a French medievalist named Jacques Le Goff, and he said this about life at the time in the 14th century. He said, it was dominated by agrarian rhythms, which is agriculture. That's what dominated it, the agrarian rhythms of farms. It was free of haste. Like, that's even hard for us to imagine. There was no hurrying. It was careless of exactitude. Like, it was just kind of this posture of like, we'll get around to it. Like, it was careless of exactitude and unconcerned by productivity. Can you even imagine living life in a culture unconcerned with productivity? I cannot wrap my mind around that. But the clock changed all of that. It created something that existed before, but now it gave it an artificial name, time, where they could count the seconds and count the minutes and count the hours. But in addition to counting the seconds, the minutes, and the hours, now you could count down the seconds, the minutes, and the hours until the next one. And ultimately, what we did as a species is we wrapped ourselves in bondage, unlike humanity had ever experienced before, to have conversations, thoughts, and temptations we'd never had before. Thoughts like, what time is it? And how much longer until it's my turn? And what comes next? And when's my next break? With the arrival of the clock, we stopped listening to our bodies in sync with the rhythm of creation. We no longer woke at the moment that our body had rested enough, but now all of a sudden we were setting the time by which we would begin to awaken. And so we built these things called alarm clocks that in the stillness of the morning would all of a sudden abruptly attack that stillness with annoying loud sounds, right? Humanity definitely became more efficient with the arrival of the clock, but it also cost us a lot. Because when we created a machine to kind of measure our most precious commodity, time, we actually became a little less human and a little more mechanical as a result. Have you ever been on vacation and lost track of time? Like, that's a fascinating feeling if you've ever done it. I pray you get to if you never have. Where you're not real sure, like, is it lunch yet or is it not lunch? Is it still breakfast or is it dinner time? Like, I'm kind of hungry, but I really have no idea what time it is, or lose track of what day it is. Like, what is today, Wednesday or Thursday? Like, I'm not real sure. I'm not real sure what tomorrow is. It's almost like, for me, in the few times it's happened, it's almost like, wow, like I breathe. I'm just like, I think this is what it means to kind of be free in Christ and not necessarily bound up to certain things, to just kind of have that that loose freeness or carefree reality. It's almost like I think as followers of Jesus, we should experience that more regularly. Let me share with you one historian's view of this moment in history, the 14th to 15th century, looking at the evidence of what it presented and how the culture changed as he was looking back on it. And he says, here was man's declaration of independence from the sun. I don't need you anymore, sun, to tell my time. I have a clock. New proof of his mastery over himself and his surroundings. Only later would it be revealed that man had accomplished this mastery by putting himself under the dominion of a machine with imperious demands all its own. When the sun set our rhythms of work and rest, it did so, placing us under the control and authority of our Creator. But with the clock, now our creation, we can actually rise above the sun and the moon and in God's rhythm, and find that the clock is actually a much more demanding, much more stressful, much more unforgiving master than God ever promises to be. If we jump from 1370 ahead 7 decades to 1440, the Gutenberg printing press was invented. And if you're aware of all of that, the ability to mass produce books and papers and information, it led to a radical change over the next 200 years. Literacy was now something that was on people's radar. Like now that you can mass produce things, people have to be able to read it. And so they began to move in that direction to teach people to read because the information was accessible. In the next couple hundred years after the printing press, you saw the rise of Bibles being translated and shared at the resistance of church leaders at the time. But it was being shared in the common tongue of those who could read and reflect on God's word in their own language. And that led to the Protestant Reformation. And an enlightenment period, all that was kind of triggered by the creation of the printing press. And then you move on in the next couple hundred years following that, and now there's this thing called universities and education, and you see technological innovation because they could communicate through written word, and they could capture things and design things and create patterns for things. And that led to an industrialized world eventually. So the clock was pivotal. The printing press was pivotal. But now jump forward with me to the technical marvel that turned the entire world upside down and opened a whole new unexplored possibility. In 1879, Edison gave us the light bulb, something we're benefiting from even this very moment. Now the day could no longer be restrictive, but it could be extended beyond sunset. Lights could illuminate the entire world indefinitely. Did you know that prior to Edison, the average person slept 11 hours a day? 11 hours a day, because their sleep was so intimately connected to the rhythm of the sun and the moon and the guidelines that God had kind of created for creation. Today, our average in North America is 7 hours. So in 150 years, we have shortened the amount of sleep that we get by 4 hours every single day. That's 28 hours a week. Maybe that plays into why some of us often feel so overwhelmed and exhausted. Especially when we consider that we've now gained 28 hours a week, and yet at the same time our lives are so much easier than they were in 1879. Throughout the 1800s and 1700s. I mean, think about all the time-saving, incredible gifts, labor-saving devices that we have now. For instance, in winter, everyone used to have to go out into their own woods with an axe or an awl, and they would have to bring down a tree, chop it up into firewood, and then figure out a way to transport it back to their house. If they had animals, a lot of times they'd down the tree, and then they'd drag it with an animal back to the house and cut it up there. But they had to do it all by hand. Now we have chainsaws and gasoline, and we have four-wheelers and tractors that can haul stuff around, and even entire processing equipment to mass produce firewood. And maybe for you, it's like, I don't fire up a chainsaw at all to get firewood. We make a phone call, and within a day or two, they dump a pile of it, and we just stack it up. Or maybe you're like me and I don't even have to worry about stacking firewood. I just go over to a wall, I push a button, and in a few minutes my house is warmer, right? Like we have incredibly wonderful and easy things that have saved us a ton of labor. We used to walk everywhere. Now we get in a car, we can go from one place to the next. And yet when people walked, they weren't in so much of a hurry to get there, and now we're in a hurry everywhere we're going. Everything is time. I got to squeeze as much as I can into the day. We used to grow, store, and process all our own food, then make our meals from scratch. Now we have takeout, we have fast food, we have this wonderful thing called Stewart shops that you can swing in and get everything you need that you're running out of. We used to write letters by hand and communicate slowly. Now we have email and texting for instant communication. And many of us, when we see someone texting us and we see those three little dots, we're like, come on, get on with it. Get me the message. I've got other stuff to do. We have programmable coffee pots, dishwashers, washers and dryers to do our laundry, microwaves. If we don't have time to put a Pop-Tart in the toaster, we can throw it in the microwave for 2 seconds. Ovens, crock pots, Alexa, smartphones, apps, and so many other time-saving devices. And yet, so many of us feel as if we have less time today, not more. So when you look at, we sleep less and we have all these time-saving devices that don't require as much labor. It's easier to live now than it used to be. Where's all that time gone? All the time that we've saved by all these inventions, where is it? We sleep less, we're awake more. Why are we so exhausted? Well, the Harvard Business Review conducted a study on changes with how we spend time in America. It was in 2016 or 2017. One cultural phenomenon that is not the same now as it once was is how we evaluate success or wealth now in our culture. If you go back to 40 or 50 years ago and before that, it was seen if someone had leisure time, if they had margin in their life, they were seen as successful and wealthy. So for instance, they would play tennis, or people would sail, or people would play golf. And it was this idea that, wow, if you can do those things, then you're really wealthy. Like if you have the time and energy to get to spend on those things. But that's changed now. There's a new sign of wealth or success. We didn't know this. No one taught us this, but it's now intuitive in our culture. It's what we grow up exposed to, and then we participate. And it's the National Board of Review, or the Harvard Business Review identified that it's when people are busy, we assume they have a lot going on and they're in high demand. So when somebody's running ragged, wow, they're successful, they're wealthy, they're doing good at life. And in fact, if you add up the average number of hours collectively as a society on average that we work per year compared to 40 years ago, the year I was born, 1979, 40 years ago, people worked a total of 4 weeks less a year than we work today. So that time, that extra time that we have, it's being invested, it's being spent, but it's most often being spent on work. 4 more weeks working than the people did 40 years ago. And a lot of the reason we work more is because we have aggressively canceled the Sabbath rhythm that we talked about last week. Until the 60s, and even in some places, as recently as the 90s, blue laws were in place in states and local areas. And blue laws existed to kind of restrict businesses from opening on Sundays. It was almost like the government wanted to put a speed limit on the pace of our lives by saying Sundays you can't be open, Sundays you can't sell, Sundays you can't buy certain things. We're going to give people that day off. And so, like, I remember growing up, and everything was focused on those 6 days. Nothing really happened on Sundays except church. We didn't even go out to eat when I was a kid on Sundays. There weren't that many places open. And so we'd go to grandma's. That's where the whole family would converge. And there was a lot of fellowship and family around that. And my parents wouldn't even be able to fathom, when, in the early 80s, they wouldn't even be able to fathom this idea that my sports activities would happen on Sundays. Like, it would not even cross their mind. And if somebody presented that, they'd be like, well, he's not participating. He's out. I mean, I remember that we had gas stations in my town. Well, we called them service stations. You remember those? Those are gone. You drive across the little bubble and ding, and out somebody comes. They're checking your wipers and washing your windshield, filling your tank, and you just get to sit there. Yeah, so that's one labor-saving thing that's gone. We have to pump our own gas now. But I remember there were service stations that were not open on Sundays. In times when we would need to get gas to get to grandma's for lunch, so we would have to go out of our way to one of the 3 or 4 gas stations in the town that were even open. I remember when our small shopping mall, it was very tiny, actually started opening on Sundays from noon to 6, and that was like a big deal in town. So in one generation, our society got very, very busy. The American dream got very, very noisy. And now, as a result of that, we work so much to buy a lot of stuff that we want, but we really don't need. We never stop finding new errands to run, and we rush and rush and rush around at an unsustainable pace, and we eat out a lot more, and we have so much more work to do that we have to do it every single day, and we don't even see how it's possible we can even participate in Sabbath, and we have to be busy all hours of the day and even into the night. And why am I saying all this? Well, I'm saying this, one, because I'm guilty of it, just as much as anybody is, at living at this pace. And in the middle of it all, our culture as a whole has not once slowed down long enough to ask, is this good for us? What will we lose with so much busyness and noise in our lives? And if we thought it was bad up until the 70s, 80s, and 90s, then 2007 came. A year that the future will look back on always remembered as a moment kind of like the light bulb, where the pace that was already quick quickened far more. And the world got a lot smaller. 2007 was the year that Steve Jobs kind of unleashed the iPhone into the wild. It was a few months after Facebook opened from just college campuses to anybody with an email address. It was the year that a microblogging internet sensation called Twitter became its own platform. It was the birth year of the cloud, where apps and app stores were now on the horizon, all these technological tools that we would need and not be able to function without. A list of other technological breakthroughs as well, all right around 2007, the birth of the digital age. In very recent memory, none of us had a smartphone. None of us had Wi-Fi access. Now we can't even imagine living without something that didn't exist just a few years ago. Now we get irritated when the Wi-Fi is not fast enough when we're at a doctor's office or a shopping mall or a hotel. I mean, the internet changed the world. It changed our day-to-day lives in so many ways, and it gave us incredible gifts. Incredible gifts. I mean, the fact that we can be in the car and we can talk face-to-face with my siblings or my nieces and nephews and with my kids and their cousins. And it's remarkable, the gifts that we have. But not every change that it's brought about has been for the better. Depending on who you talk to, the studies are pretty conclusive that as smart as our phones are, it's actually making us dumber. Because it's making things that used to be a little more challenging so much easier, which sounds great, but there's a byproduct of that. Decreasing our IQs, or at least decreasing our capacity to pay attention. In North America, our attention spans have been shrinking. It's now down to 8 seconds before we need some sort of stimuli to keep us engaged. 8 seconds. So that means I've been talking for about 20 minutes. Divide that by 8 seconds. How many times have you had to be like, oh, what did he say there? And you kind of came back, right? To give you some sort of comparison, a goldfish, their attention span is 9 seconds. So in all of our evolutionary advancement, we have now fallen beneath goldfish with the ability to pay attention. But think about the smartphone. I mean, it put unlimited amounts of information in the front right pocket of every pair of blue jeans. And it put that information in the back right pocket of everybody wearing skinny jeans, because I've been told you can't fit it in the front pocket of skinny jeans. At least that's what I'm told by Jim Brown. Now get this, a study from 2016 on businessinsider.com found that the average smartphone user touches his or her phone 2,617 times a day. Now if you shrink that sample size to millennials, it's twice that. It's over 5,000 times a day. But the average on whole is 2,617 times a day, and the average that each of us are on a device is 2.5 hours a day over 76 individual sessions. So the truth is, our lives are filled with content. We don't need more content. Our lives are filled with noise in ever-increasing ways. And we can begin to look at what's trending in our society and see the impact that all of this accessibility to content and all of this technological advancement, the impact it's having on relationships or families, on the development of our kids. In fact, there's stories now coming out of Silicon Valley, right? The mecca of technological advancement and innovation. There's stories now of these employees, managers, and higher up corporate heads of tech companies. They're paying top dollar to enroll their students into private schools that are technology free. Think about that. They're making a living off of increasing technology, and yet in their own homes, they're wanting to isolate their kids away from the impact of it, because they see it's a great tool, but there's a byproduct of it. There's a consequence. Now, I know what you're thinking. We're not using technology today. Are we ever going to use it again after Feder talks about this message? Yes, we will. Because like I said, technology in and of itself is not immoral. It's amoral. It's how we use it. It's how we interact with it. It's the boundaries that we set. The guardrails to protect us, to keep us focused on what really matters. And others of you are thinking, man, this is the longest introduction Feder's ever had to a message. How long is this sermon going to be? But I promise I'm getting somewhere. I know we haven't read a single verse yet, but I want to ask this question. Is the pace that we're sucked into running in our world, is it wise? Is it good for us? Is it beneficial for our souls? Not just our kids, but us. Is this pace, this busyness, this noise beneficial for our souls? You know, Jesus is quoted in Matthew's gospel in Matthew 16:26. I know some of you normally write the scriptures down on the screen. I'll try to communicate these all to you. But Matthew 16:26, Jesus says this: what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? It's like Jesus knew we would need to ask this question in different seasons of our lives. Is this good for me? Is this good for my soul? I mean, we have the world at our fingertips, and oftentimes we're worn out and exhausted, especially right now with all that we're facing, not only in our state and our country, but across the world. The unknowns about what's going to happen next week. How are things going to play out next month? How soon will Clorox wipes be on the shelves again? All of these unknowns can so easily pull us away from the way of Jesus. You know, it's interesting. This last week, my wife and I were doing the social media fast, and I didn't realize what I had been saved from by the timing of this schedule that kind of we set as a church. And so I got on last night just to kind of post something on Facebook for people that were still on it, and in regards to our worship gatherings today. And I kind of got caught up on some of my notifications and browsed Facebook for a little bit. And I realized I didn't know how many pictures of empty store shelves were being posted these last few days. And I was almost like, wow, God, thank you. I was rescued from increased anxiety or rescued from thinking I needed to provide for myself, but trusting that you're going to provide for me. But all these unknowns in life, all that we're facing, can quickly pull us away from the way of Jesus. Remember, the way of Jesus, it's not just about theological agreements. Yes, I believe Jesus paid for my sin. Yes, I believe it's grace through faith. I believe I'm made new, and I believe I'm restored as a son of God. That those theological beliefs, yes, it's believing morally that this is what God says is right and wrong and kind of checking those boxes. But it's also a lifestyle that Jesus came to model for us of how to live. The pace of life, the focus of life, disciplines in life, boundaries in life. So in light of all that we've talked about, both when life is normal and when pandemics are on our streets, is there a practice in this life of Jesus, this way of Jesus, that could set us up to thrive in the chaos of modern society? Is there something Jesus presents as a rhythm in our lives that helps us navigate all of this noise, all of this chaos? And there is. It's very simply called silence and solitude. That's what we're going to talk about briefly. Now, I know what you're thinking. The solitude part might seem a little easy right now because people all over kind of self-quarantining themselves away from the world for 2 weeks or however long, which I think some of those that are joining us, we had over 100 in the 9 o'clock service. A lot of them just want to binge watch 7 seasons of a show and they want an easy excuse. So we get your quarantine. I'm just kidding. But as we turn to the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 3, we can see how this rhythm played itself out in Jesus' life, silence and solitude. In verse 13, Matthew tells us Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Jesus replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. And so John submitted. He consented. Okay, Jesus, whatever you say. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Think about this moment of the heavens opening, the voice of God being heard, and the very next step Jesus is to take is to be isolated, to go to the wilderness alone. This Greek word for wilderness is the word eremos. And it can also be translated not only wilderness, but the desert or the quiet place or the solitary place or even the lonely place. Have you ever read this account, verse 16, and had this thought, like, okay, so Jesus comes up out of the water, and at that moment the heavens open and the Spirit of God descends like a dove, and people hear God's audible voice, my Son who I love, I'm well pleased. Then right after that, Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be attacked for temptation by the devil. You ever read that and kind of thought, like, whose idea was this? Like, this is not a good plan. Like, this is like a mountain peak moment, and then right after that, Jesus goes into a valley of like despair and loneliness and hunger for 40 days and 40 nights. It's like, really? Like, was God at the wheel that day? Like, shouldn't there have been like a rally after people hearing the audible voice of God where thousands could converge and they could tell this story and the witnesses could say, we heard the voice of God from the sky. This is my Son. This is the Messiah. We got to follow him. Let's go. And there was like a revolutionary change in culture. Shouldn't this have been the moment where Jesus maybe wrote a book and they could begin to copy it and transmit the truth about what God wanted to say to us through Jesus? Shouldn't Jesus have done like some miracles there just to kind of capitalize on this moment? But the Spirit of God says, now is the time for you to go into the wilderness, the Eremos, from the mountain peak to the valley, where you will enter into a UFC cage match toe-to-toe with the enemy of God, the tempter, the devil, Satan himself, to try to get you to disobey your Father and squander the whole reason you're here. Jesus is about to be tempted in the lonely place, the wilderness. And the Spirit of God is not only okay with this happening, but the Spirit of God drove him there, putting the Son of God in a place where the enemy of God could attack when he's weakened and alone. Matthew tells us what happens next, the very next verse, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights. He doesn't give us anything else beside that. Then the Spirit of God led Jesus to the wilderness to be tempted by the enemy. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights. I didn't skip anything. That's literally what Matthew tells us. Jumps right to the end of this period of time. And after this period of time of Jesus being in the lonely place where there's, Jesus didn't have Netflix or a cell phone. He didn't have Sudoku to waste his time or Instagram. He didn't have food to eat. I mean, most of us, if we're honest, we struggle with the idea of going 7 days without one of those things. I mean, this week the emphasis is television and movies. And some of us are like, wow, 7 days without not turning on the screen? Jesus is fasting from everything and everyone. And after 40 days of what we would often say, that's pure hell on earth, Matthew says the greatest understatement in Scripture. He was hungry. No kidding. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And then Matthew says, here's where the temptation begins. Not on day 1, not on day 10, not day 30, not day 39, but day 40. And at first we can kind of start to think, wow, it sounds just like Satan. Hit somebody when they're down. Hit them when they're at their weakest, when they're the most weary, when they're the most tired. He's been alone for 40 days. He hasn't eaten for 40 days. He's been in solitude and silence. He's hungry. Now Satan's going to attack. And it can lead you to wonder and question God. God, if you knew this is when it was going to happen, wouldn't it have been better for Jesus for those 40 days to be around disciples and be reminded of his love for them and why he's here? Wouldn't it have been better for Jesus to do a bunch of miracles so you'd know how strong he is and how much power he has by the power of your Spirit in him? I mean, normally when we think of this moment, we interpret the story to mean that the tempter, Satan, shows up. And the devil's strategy is to try to tempt Jesus to disobey God when Jesus is at his physical weakest. When he's lonely, tired, and hungry. Don't you often feel that sometimes when temptation seizes you the strongest is in those moments when you're tired and weary and hungry or lonely? Well, see, here's where God flips the script. He wants us to see that the Eremos places, the quiet place, the lonely place, these are not the places where we're the weakest. They're actually the places we're the strongest. See, the Spirit of God led Jesus to the quiet place because he knew he would need 40 days of solitude, 40 days of silence away from the noise of the world so that he'd be ready for the tempter. So he could have victory over Satan face to face in the cage. And what happens there, remember this is the early part, this is Matthew 3. It happens, we see it, read this again, this account again in Mark chapter 1. It's at the very beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry. It's right after his baptism. It's immediate. It's an urgent thing. It's like God says to his son, I need you to learn the value where your strength comes from in relationship to me. So you've got to spend 40 days in the Eremos. You've got to see the beauty of the Eremos. You've got to see the power to withstand temptation that's only found in the silence and solitude. And we see Jesus develop this rhythm throughout the rest of his ministry, his life, for the next 3 years. In Mark 1, after the baptism, after the wilderness experience, when Jesus returns and he's ministering for a few days, we read this in verse 35 of Mark 1:35, very early in the morning while it was still dark. Jesus got up, no alarm needed, left the house and went off to a solitary place in Eremos where he prayed. I mean, Jesus intentionally incorporated times of withdrawing from the chaos of the world into silence and solitude for prayer. We see it again 5 chapters later in Mark chapter 6. There's this moment where Jesus sent the disciples out to do ministry and to do miracles in his name, and they do, and they gather back together by the Sea of Galilee, and they're like, Jesus, we got so many stories to tell you. This amazing stuff happened, miracles happened, the power of your name, and people are gathering and flocking, and they want to know more, and they want to meet you, and they want you to touch them, and they want healing. And so in Mark chapter 6, verse 30, Mark 6:30, it says, Mark says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Very next verse, 31. Jesus says, the next verse, then because so many people were coming and going, they didn't even have a chance to eat, him and the disciples, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to an eremos, quiet place, and get some rest. I mean, Jesus once again showing us like this rhythm of slowing down and withdrawing, but now he's pulling his disciples into this rhythm with him to escape the chaos, even to set aside the stories of victory and celebration, to set those aside and rediscover where strength comes from. So they set off across the lake on a boat. He's like, all right, we can't get away from here, so let's get on a boat. Let's go across the lake. What they didn't anticipate is there was groups of people there walking around the lake, and there were groups waiting. And by the time they docked the boat on the other side of the sea, all of a sudden there's a huge crowd waiting for them there. And Mark tells us that this is one of those verses, Jesus in compassion for those that were there, he began to teach and he healed some. You read that in the next verses, 36, 37, 38. And all of a sudden you find out it's getting late. So Jesus wanted to withdraw with his disciples, wasn't really able to continue to do ministry. And yet Jesus still has this burden, this need to get away from the crowds for rest and prayer, because there's just too much chaos going on. And Jesus knows it's not that he just wants the quiet place. It's not that he desires to withdraw. He needs the lonely place to renew his strength and to remember where his strength comes from. So what does Jesus do so that he can escape all these crowds with his disciples, where he can go to bat for his disciples and pull them away from the chaos? It's interesting. Here is where Jesus feeds the 5,000. With 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, all the food they could find in the crowd that day. Jesus takes it, he multiplies it, and he feeds everybody. One of his disciples even speaks up and says at one point, it would take more than a half a year's wages to pay for the food for this many people. And Jesus takes something small and seemingly insignificant in the hands of a boy, and he multiplies it for eternal impact. Something we still talk about today. You jump forward in Mark 6 to verse 42. We read, they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls, 1 basket apiece, of broken pieces of bread and fish, the leftovers. Verse 44, the number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Verse 45, immediately, Mark says. So this gives us a sense of urgency. So Jesus, they bring the bread and the fish. He prays over it. It multiplies. They distribute it. Everybody's eaten. They're satisfied. They haven't just had a little bit to kind of whet their appetite. They are satisfied. People have gone back for seconds and thirds, and there's still 12 baskets of leftovers. This miracle. And yet the whole reason Jesus did this is so that immediately Jesus could have his disciples get into a boat. That's what verse 45 says. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. Guys, get in the boat now. Don't worry about me in the crowd. You've done a great job kind of, helping me minister to the crowd. That time is over. Get in the boat and go on ahead of me to Bethsaida. I will dismiss the crowd. Jesus, can you imagine Jesus now without the disciples saying, that's it, we're done. We're putting up the close sign. It's over. Go back home. We fed you. We ministered. It's over. We're going somewhere else. So he dismisses the crowd. After leaving the crowd, verse 46, Jesus went up on a eremos, a mountainside, to pray. Most of us have never realized, even though you might be familiar with this biblical story, that the feeding of the 5,000 was really a fast way for Jesus to demonstrate who he was and what he could do, that he was the Son of God. To do that quickly in a way in which he could get his disciples to escape the chaos. I mean, think about it. Jesus relentlessly chases the solitary place, the lonely place, the desert place where he can re-engage with God. It's almost as if Jesus, between the crowd, the noise, Jesus steps in between the disciples and the noise so that they can escape it. I mean, it's a beautiful metaphor of what God still wants to do in all of our lives. He wants to step in between the noisy world around us and us. He wants to step in so we can find him in the midst of it. When you go to Luke's gospel, I'm not going to read them all, but there's 9 more times that Luke talks about Jesus withdrawing from crowds. And there's one moment in Luke chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, where Luke tells us that this was a regular pattern for Jesus. He doesn't just talk about one time where Jesus withdrew, but he says this, the news about Jesus spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and be healed from their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and pray. This is the moment where everybody wants a little bit of Jesus. And he often withdrew. It's almost like they'd look around and be like, where's Jesus? Oh, he's probably off praying again. It's like he did it all the time. He turned off his phone, plugged it into the charger, walked away, shut down the television, found a comfy chair, and took a posture of prayer with his father. It's interesting what we read here because it's typically the opposite of what we do. As people wanted a slice of Jesus, they wanted more of his attention. That's when Jesus' escape to the lonely places increased. And I would assume for us it's the opposite. At least when I get the busiest, when I have the most on my plate in a given week or month, often the areas that get cheated the quickest are time with God in the quiet place and time and attention with my family, my wife and my girls. Because I've got so many other things, the noise in my head of all the other things I've got to do and get done. And if I don't do them now, when am I going to get them done? Because there's more things coming tomorrow. So very practically, I just want to close with offering a couple of introductions to these rhythms and even ways you can begin to experiment with them if you never have, or if you could increase them in experimentation a little bit in your life. Especially this week, as we are fasting television and movies, to kind of set aside something that often may be a daily rhythm in our life, to kind of set that aside. Now we have some time to redirect. So first with silence, there's two different types of silence. There's internal silence and external silence. The external is much easier to turn off because you can hit a power button on the television, the radio, the news. You can withdraw from a loud environment and go somewhere that's quiet. You can get out in nature. But even though we silence the external, that doesn't solve the problem, because for many of us, silencing the external is easy. It's silencing the internal dialogue, the internal noise that's hard. If we were honest, there's many of us that probably like a lot of external stimulation because it helps us escape having to deal with our own thoughts. The internal noise is where your insecurities replay in your mind. The internal noise is the conversations you've had with people that you wish you could change. It's where your failures replay, of where you dropped the ball, where you've fallen short. The internal dialogue is where your fantasies run wild, where your hurts continue to live, and that person that hurt you and the dreams of them getting theirs or getting revenge. It's where you dream up what you're going to say next time when you're around that person that you feel insecure around. It's where even fantasies of desires that you have kind of go unchecked. When I'm talking about silence, I'm talking about a willingness and commitment to silence both the external and the internal. And you have to understand that this is not something that you can do for an hour at a time if it's never been a rhythm for you. You've got to be okay with just starting with 60 seconds, a minute, so you can learn the beauty of silence. Some of us need to admit that silence is even uncomfortable because it's so foreign to us. There's a moment where Elijah, the prophet in the Old Testament, has gone through a lot of stuff, and God shows up. It's kind of a mountaintop moment. Literally on a mountaintop. And Elijah runs in fear, and he finds himself battling depression. And God wants to speak to him. And what he learns is a profound lesson for all of us, that God is not in the noise. He's in the silence. The word we use in that text is whisper. But really what the Hebrew actually meant was it was in sheer silence that he heard the voice of God. But there's a difference between, so that's silence. That's silence. The other one is solitude. This has nothing to do with isolating yourself away from a virus, okay? But realizing that the noise of the world around us is a deadly virus every single day. That we are so stimulated and so bombarded with messages and volume and noise. And you have to understand, too, that solitude and isolation are not the same thing. Solitude is when you kind of set aside time to feed and water and nourish your soul in relationship to God. Solitude is engaging. Isolation is trying to escape. Solitude is safe. Isolation is dangerous. Isolation makes you, me, the central focus. Solitude makes God the central focus. His voice, His will. Solitude is when we set aside time to feed and water and nourish our soul. To start small with a minute, 2 minutes of silence and solitude, and let it grow from there. Begin to see it as something we look forward to, because it just helps us navigate all the other noise so much better. It's where God speaks wisdom to us. And don't allow this idea of silence and solitude to sound somber, like, oh, that sounds miserable. It's not. Solitude is not loneliness. The two are completely different. One of the most profound books ever written on spiritual disciplines a few decades ago was a book by Richard Foster called Celebration of Discipline. I remember reading it in college, and its focus is on spiritual disciplines. And he tries to write this book from the position of we should celebrate these ways, these rhythms God has laid out for us to live life in, because it's how we live the free life Jesus promises us to live. That if we live the pattern of the world of our life the way we see the world living it, we're not going to experience that freedom. We're going to experience further bondage. And he makes this statement about solitude and loneliness. He says, loneliness is inner emptiness. Solitude is inner fulfillment. Which is a fascinating thought, because oftentimes what we're looking for is fulfillment, significance. And Richard Foster is arguing that the only way to get there is solitude, time alone with God, to know who he is and know who we are. One of the great problems of spirituality in our culture is something that honestly many Christians don't feel safe enough to admit because we're so concerned with what other people think of us. But one common problem for practicing Christians in our day and age is that oftentimes we feel distant from God. If I was to ask you, do you regularly experience God's presence throughout each day? Statistics show us that most say, no, I don't. Maybe you do on Sundays. Maybe you do on one other day of the week when you're in a disciple maker group. If you're a Jesus follower and I asked you, does love, joy, and peace, does that describe what you feel following Jesus day in and day out? Statistics show us that majority would say no. Like, they're great concepts, and I want to hope that they're true, but to feel loved by God and to feel a joy that supersedes my circumstance and to be at peace with God, but at peace with others and be a carrier of peace, most Christians in our culture say, no, that's not a daily feeling or sensation of this relationship with God. And so statistics tell us that sometimes we come to church worship gatherings regularly because we want to get a God fill up. Kind of need our cup to be full so that way throughout the course of the week, as it empties, we can survive. We need this fleeting moment of connection to God to be reminded by noise, whether it's a song being sung or a video being played or a scripture being read or someone praying or a pastor speaking. We need these fleeting moments where somebody else is engaging us or connecting us to God. Because quite honestly, we struggle to discover how to do that on our own. And for some of us, we may say we need a God fill up on Sundays because we know we've got to return to a dark, broken, secular wasteland of our world. And the only way we can survive is if our cup is filled. Which once again makes the focus on me, not on him. And it shows that my faith is more in my ability to try to survive than on his ability to provide everything I need to thrive in this life. So I want to kind of present to you that the antidote for a spiritual illness of kind of feeling distant from God, if that's how you feel, the antidote could be as easy as beginning to experiment intentionally with silence and solitude before God, before Jesus Christ. I believe sometimes the distance that we feel between us and God is not showing us that God has pulled away from us, but it actually shows we've been so busy and preoccupied we have distanced ourselves from him. And the only way to re-engage is to turn off the external noise as we do. So we're going to, it's kind of our closing prayer. I'm going to read Psalm 46, and we're just going to sing one last chorus. The lyrics are really drawn from this psalm, but I just think it's just a beautifully written letter from God to us at the time in which we find ourselves today. God is our refuge and strength, a tested help in times of trouble. And so we need not fear even if the world blows up and the mountains crumble into the sea. Let the oceans roar and foam. Let the mountains tremble. There is a river of joy flowing through the city of our God, the sacred home of the God above all gods. God himself is living in that city. Therefore, it stands unmoved despite the turmoil everywhere. He will not delay his help. The nations rant and rave in anger, but when God speaks, the earth melts in submission and kingdoms totter into ruin. The commander of the armies of heaven is here among us. He, the God of Jacob, has come to rescue us. Come see the glorious things that our God does. Stand silent. Know that I am God. I will be honored by every nation in the world. The commander of the heavenly armies is here among us. He, the God of Jacob, has come to rescue us. And all God's people agreed together and said, Amen.